Thank you for listening to Mormon Sex Info. This episode is an archived episode and is only now becoming publicly available. Mormon Sex Info relies on contributions. To contribute, please visit mormonsex.info. And now, please enjoy this episode.
Hello, welcome to Mormon Sex Info. This is Natasha Helfer Parker, and I'm extremely privileged and happy to report that I have Dr. Marty Klein with me today on the show. It's just a real pleasure. I've followed his work for a while. He's the author of Sexual Intelligence and a fairly new book that came out, I believe, last year called His Porn, Her Pain, a book I've referred to often. And we're here to discuss a lot of interesting concepts and maybe for a lot of people controversial concepts. So we're going to try to do that in a way that's meaningful and respectful to hopefully everyone who's listening, who I know there's a lot of ideas and myths and morality and beliefs, et cetera, around this issue of pornography. And I've had many people on the show before talking about these kind of complex things. So hope you keep an open mind as you listen. And Dr. Klein, would you like me to call you Dr. Klein or Marty?
Well, you can call me Marty.
Okay, just in this interview. I'll go back to Dr. Klein if I see you in person. But so Marty, welcome to the show. Thank you for being here. Please take a minute or two to introduce yourself further to us.
Oh, I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist for 37 years, probably since before you were born, Natasha. And I'm the author of seven books about sexuality, and I have testified in Congress, given about 1,000 keynote speeches around the country and in about 40 different countries. And I love my work, which is bringing sexual healing to the planet and to individual men and women and couples. I've done 37,000 sessions of therapy, can you believe it, with men and women and couples. About half of that oriented towards sexuality and the other half oriented to the rest of things that people need a little bit of assistance with.
Sure. Well, thank you. That's amazing. That's an amazing history. So I want to start the conversation with the book that you wrote, His Porn, Her Pain. And right off the bat, I guess I just want to ask you a little bit. I always try when I talk about pornography to not just always assume it's the man viewing the pornography versus the woman. But your book, in a sense, kind of talks to a lot of the stereotypes or the maybe more statistically relevant scenarios which we see in our country, which is the man is the porn viewer, the woman is the betrayed spouse. Can you talk a little bit about
not the
framing?
Betrayed spouse, not the betrayed spouse, the spouse.
The spouse who's feeling betrayed. How about
the
that?
Spouse who feels uncomfortable.
Yes. So could you talk a little bit about why you set it up that way?
Absolutely.
First? Yes.
Absolutely. People ask me all the time, where'd you get that title, His Porn, Her Pain? Well, I see lots of couples, and some of those couples are in conflict about pornography. I see gay male couples, they don't have any conflict about porn. I see lesbian couples, they don't have any conflict about porn. I see a lot of heterosexual couples. I see mostly heterosexual couples. And it's very rare, very, very rare, that men are complaining about women looking at porn. So virtually all of the conflict that I see in my office about pornography, and I see a lot of it, virtually all of the conflict that I see is women complaining about men looking at porn. So I thought, well, if I want to talk about pornography, that's the place to start with the most common configuration, which is that men look at it. For the most part, women kind of are either okay about it or they ignore it. But there are a substantial number of women who are very upset about the fact that their boyfriend or their husband looks at pornography. So I thought, might as well write about that. And as you know from having read the book, Natasha, there's a lot of other stuff in the book too. There's stuff about how to raise your kids in consideration of the fact that they're going to look at pornography or they're going to be exposed to it. What to do if you, the reader, are afraid that your porn habits are out of control. I also talk about the fact that there's a substantial number of women who enjoy looking at pornography too. So there's a lot of the book is about helping couples talk to each other about, he looks at porn and she doesn't like it. What are we going to do? So that's how I got the title, and that's what the book is about.
Okay, great. So can we talk a little bit about where that comes from? So is it just like biological that women are more slated to not like pornography or the viewing of it? I mean, you start your book
I don't
a lot
think
with
that's a
some
helpful.
cultural
I don't think that's
norms.
I don't think that's a helpful question, because we are never going to know what is purely biological about hardly anything. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, it's commonplace. The neuroscientists tell us that men are more visually oriented than women. Okay. Women read romance novels, and romance novels are exactly what pornography is, visual pornography is for men. I mean, romance novels are about power, romance novels are about yearning, romance novels are about unfulfilled women wanting to redeem a wild guy. So it appears as if when men consume erotic imagery, it's more likely going to be visual. When women consume erotic imagery, it's going to be more literary. How much of that is biological, how much not? I don't know. There's probably a biological component to it, but that's the way that it is, and that's the way that it's been for a long time, going all the way back to the beginning of time when people were drawing pictures of people having sex on caves or on Grecian pottery.
Sure. Yes, I think my point with that question is more about setting it up to understand the cultural background we come from and how we have scripts and narratives and kind of sexual histories as a people that help inform why some of these things might be hurtful or have certain feelings attached to it. And you go into quite a bit of at least internet history at the very beginning of your book. Do you want to give a basic kind of just Cliff Note version of kind of what the current climate is in our country?
You think people know what Cliff Notes are anymore?
Oh, they don't?
I
I guess I'm getting older too, huh?
I don't know. Well, in the year 2000, the internet was very, very basic and very slow and didn't have a lot of commerce attached to it. And in the year 2000, broadband transformed the internet into something that everybody could use every day, and everybody did use every day. And of course, as we know throughout history, every new technology is adapted to sexual purposes as quickly as possible, whether it's nylon, whether it's rubber, whether it's the car, whether it's the electrification of downtowns, whether it's the printing press. Human beings are so interested in sex, and that is biological.
Right.
Human beings have built into their wiring that they're interested in sex, and that has been true in every place on the planet Earth, in every era of human existence. And so every time somebody invents something new, somebody invents the VCR, somebody invents synthetic rubber, anytime anybody invents something, somebody very quickly adapts that for sexual purposes, and then everybody uses the sexual adaptation of that new technology. And in fact, it's very clear that if you invent a new technology and you want it to last, it better have a sexual application. Mm-hmm. So, year 2000, broadband comes along, transforms the internet. The speeds are incredibly fast. The clarity of the pictures becomes amazing. There's a syncing of the voice with the visual. And so, of course, people immediately adapt that for sexual purposes, in this case, pornography. And suddenly, there's pornography, there's access to pornography in everybody's home, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And nobody was ready for this. In the year 2000, nobody was ready for this. Nobody was ready for the internet part of this. Nobody was ready. It's not like everybody was sitting around thinking, if only we had broadband internet, wouldn't it be great to shop at Amazon.com? Because it didn't exist. Wouldn't it be great to have webcams in our babies' cribs? Because it didn't exist. But all of a sudden, there's this disruptive technology, broadband internet. And we're still trying to figure out how to deal with that. When you see three people at a lunch table and each one of them is looking at their smartphone instead of talking to each other, that's a perfect example of how the human race is still not able to figure out, what are we going to do about this broadband internet? 500 years from now, people are going to look back at us and they're going to say, boy, this new technology got dropped into society and nobody knew what to do with it.
Right.
So pornography is just one example of that. Pornography is one example of how people are having difficulty figuring out what are healthy ways to integrate broadband internet into society? How do we integrate broadband internet into our culture without losing a lot of the things that we value, like face-to-face interaction, like the ability to actually read people's faces, which is getting lost very quickly. So broadband internet brought porn into everybody's home 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And what was the sexual culture? You want to talk about narratives and culture. What was the sexual culture in place in America? What was the sexual culture in Utah? What was the sexual culture any place in America the day that 24/7 porn got dropped into everybody's home? Let me tell you, let me remind our listeners what the sexual culture was. People didn't talk about sex in an honest way. Kids didn't have good sex education. Couples were not in the routine of talking about, how do you please me sexually? What kinds of things do you do or say that I don't especially like? Do we want to use contraception? If so, what are the implications of that? When broadband internet dropped 24/7 porn into the homes of people in America, people were not ready sexually. People didn't have a vocabulary with which to talk to each other. You know, honey, when you touch me that way, I don't especially like it. You know, honey, when you rush us to have intercourse before I'm ready, I don't feel important to you. You know, honey, there ought to be a way for you to ask, can we have sex without you using rough language? Whatever it is, whatever it is. You know, honey, I'm curious about oral sex, but I'm afraid that it's immoral. Whatever it is. People didn't have that routine of talking to each other. And so broadband internet drops 24/7 porn into everybody's home, and people are like a deer in the headlights. People were no better able to deal with 24/7 porn than they were able to deal with any of the other sexual issues that they were having difficulty with. And that's still true today. 17 years later, which is the wink of an eye in terms of history, right? 17 years after 24/7 porn got dropped into everybody's home, people still don't have the vocabulary. A lot of the conversations that I have, a lot of the conversations that people have in my office, she says to him, I don't want you looking at porn, it's crap. He says, it's none of your business. She says it's immoral. He says, I'm not hurting anybody. And that's the end of the conversation. I mean, they don't know what else to say. They don't have a vocabulary. They're not in the rhythm of talking about sexuality. They're not in the rhythm of talking about their hearts either, because that's not what most couples do. Everybody's just a little too busy raising their kids and going to work and trying not to pull a hamstring muscle at the gym. So a lot of the conflict that I see in my office, in the culture in general, it looks like it's about pornography, but it's about something else. It's about sex. And as you know, Natasha, people aren't very good at talking about sex in America.
No, they're not.
And so there's this now constant conflict about pornography that is not very helpful, and it's not getting resolved because people just don't have the tools that they need to talk about it. And that's what I'm committed to doing I don't care if anybody watches pornography. I don't care. You don't want to watch it, don't watch it. You want to watch it, watch it. But my point of view is that people need tools so they can talk to each other. Because how husband and wife or boyfriend and girlfriend relate to each other, that's a much bigger issue than pornography, right? How people relate to each other sexually, that's a much more important issue than do you watch porn, do you not watch porn? So let's talk about what we really need to talk about,
right?
Which is sexuality and intimacy and relationships and how you feel in your heart, rather than settling for a small conversation that's not going very far right now because people don't have the tools that they need.
So let's talk a little bit about where the conversations have kind of gone from this cultural climate that you're describing. In other words, what are some of the common myths and even things that have happened, like you mentioned Utah with the porn health crisis, right? So there's a lot of
alleged.
Yes, absolutely alleged. I'm much more concerned about the air quality in Utah than I am about any pornography.
Right.
So what are the common kind of fears, concerns? Your brain's going to change, your your erectile dysfunction is going to be affected by pornography. Can we just talk through some of those kinds of narratives that have come from this, what you call a porn panic in the book,
Sure.
where people are afraid and they're concerned and,
Sure.
the language that we are seeing?
Sure. And before I do that, let's notice the following. If there were a big scare about bananas, if somebody got the idea that bananas are dangerous, there is a bananas importing association. There actually is an industry association of companies that import bananas into the United States, because there's a lot of that's a big business, right? There's jillions of bananas in the U.S. on any given day. None of them are grown in the U.S., right? So there's an association of importers of bananas. And if there were some sort of health scare about bananas, they would get together, they would issue press releases, they would have press conferences, they would talk to their congressmen, and they would help educate the public about this. And then there would be a statement by the American Medical Association, are bananas dangerous for you? And then the grocery chains, they would have full-page ads in the newspaper saying, we understand that there's a big scare about bananas. Well, here's our position about it, backed up by science, and so on and so on. So people would still be free to not eat bananas if they didn't want to, but they would have access to state-of-the-art information about what's up with bananas. And there would be, and when the different trade associations, or when the AMA, when they stood up and they talked about bananas, nobody would say, well, the AMA issued a report that says bananas are safe. They're obviously pro-banana. We can just ignore what they say. Nobody would say, well, a significant number of people in the AMA, these doctors, they eat bananas, and so we can't trust what they say about the safety of bananas. So if there were a big scare about bananas, the whole machinery of the culture would mobilize, and there would be legitimate voices. There would be voices that would be perceived as legitimate, or voices that would be perceived as knowledgeable.
That could be trusted, that people would trust because of their background, their expertise, etc.
And then people could decide what they wanted to do. And there would be people who would never eat a banana ever again. And then there would be people who wouldn't eat bananas, but their kids would. And, life goes on. And that would be true of pretty much any consumer product, whether it's Toyotas, whether it's skis, whatever it is. Anytime that there's any concern about consumer products, we have a whole system of addressing those concerns. And there's only one consumer product that I can think of, only one. There's only one consumer product that I could think of in this gigantic country of consumerism. There's only one consumer product that I can think of where that's not true, and that's pornography. More money is spent on pornography every year than is spent on bananas. More money is spent on pornography every year than is spent on Toyotas or skis. But that's the one product where the trade association is not given any attention by the press, where if the trade association goes to their local congressman and says, look, we need some help here, the congressman's going to say, no way, I'm not touching this, where the AMA is not going to talk about it. And so the only people who are left to talk about the effects of pornography are people who call themselves anti-pornography activists. And so there's this tremendously one-sided narrative that's getting more intense and more intense, because anybody who says, wait, let's look at other sides of this question, they're dismissed as being pro-pornography. People call me pro-pornography. I'm not pro-pornography. I'm pro, let's be thoughtful. I'm pro, what do people need to have intimate sexual relationships? I'm pro getting couples to talk to each other in a meaningful way. But according to this anti-pornography activist narrative, if you're not anti-porn, obviously you're pro-porn. Nobody says if you're not anti-banana, you must be pro-banana. Nobody says if you're anti-Toyota, you must be pro-Toyota. So there's a very, very distorted narrative. And that narrative never gets to be challenged. There's no trade association that's allowed to challenge it. There's no objective conversation with consumers who use pornography and don't have any negative effects. I mean, where's the latest congressional panel of people, half of whom consume pornography and it's ruined their lives, and half of whom they consume pornography and it's, had no negative effects whatsoever?
Or even
Where's
positive
that?
effects.
I'm not even talking about that. Not even talking about that.
Not even that.
People ask me all the time to talk about the positive aspects of looking pornography, and I pretty much don't do it. I'm not pro-porn, I'm not anti-porn. I'm not pro-porn. So this is all a run-up to, let me tell you about some facts, but why aren't these facts out on the table in your everyday conversation? I mean, look at the Utah resolution that Senator Weiler successfully shepherded through the legislature. Who in their right mind in the Utah legislature was going to stand up and say, excuse me, there isn't one single fact that you can prove in this resolution? Who in their right mind, what newspaper was going to take an editorial and say, we've looked at the assertions in this document, and it's all fantasy. It's all somebody's rant. It's all somebody's emotions that are designed to look like information. Who in their right mind is going to stand up and do that? Nobody. And that's how a resolution got through the Utah legislature, which is pretty much fact-free. And it's got whereas this and whereas that, and whereas pornography is making men less interested in marriage. I mean, that's just a crazy idea. Whereas pornography is causing all these medical problems, no data whatsoever. But who in their right mind is going to stand up? Now, if the legislature tried to pass a resolution saying, we think that too many people are eating bananas. We think that, bananas obviously are hurting the apple industry. Obviously, bananas are hurting the candy industry. If they tried to pass a resolution like that, you bet there'd be hearings. There were no hearings about this resolution. They just made it up and passed it. There would be hearings, and you'd have people from the banana industry coming in, and you'd have panels on television, on the morning TV shows. So this is all a prelude to telling you some facts, because without this context, I can tell people the facts, but they're going to say, well, you have your facts and somebody else has their facts. And, here in America, everybody is entitled to their opinion, but everybody is not entitled to their own facts. There's facts. There's facts.
Absolutely. Right. And we live in kind of this weird climate where alternative facts have become an issue. So it is. I think there's a real challenge for those of us who are experts in the field to be able to share information and not be mistrusted, especially if there's some moral overlay or kind of, bias or discrimination to begin with. I think it's just very difficult for the public to trust experts these days, which is really, in a sense, unfortunate.
Well, that's why I don't usually spend a lot of time talking about facts when people want to talk about pornography. Most people are not interested in facts. So, for example, people will say, those poor women working in pornography, look at the horrible ways that they're being exploited. Most people who say that have no idea what they're talking about. If you go down to Los Angeles, where most American pornography is made, most commercial American pornography is made, when they announce that they're going to make a new film, there are women lined up around the block trying to get selected to act in a porn film. You wouldn't have that if people were horribly treated in the industry. The truth is, your average checker at a supermarket works under worse conditions than your average porn actress. Your average porn actress has much better situation. Now, does that mean I personally or you personally would want to be a porn actress? Not necessarily, but not everybody wants to be a supermarket checker either. Not everybody wants to work graveyard shift at 7-Eleven. People who work graveyard shift at 7-Eleven have terrible jobs. There's an incredible amount of boredom. They need a certain kind of manual dexterity that over time, if you get arthritis, you don't have. You're vulnerable to stick-ups. The profit margins on the products are tiny. You have to sell a lot of unhealthy products to kids in order to make a buck. So there's a lot of problems with working graveyard shift at 7-Eleven. But it's a free country. People get to choose to do that. I don't hear a lot of people saying, I'm not going to go into 7-Eleven because they go out of their way to make candy attractive to children. They go out of their way to sell which they do. They go out of their way to sell high fat, high salt, high sugar products to tired adults. I don't hear anybody saying I'm going to stay away from 7-Eleven because of that.
Yeah, and that goes right back to your original point of when the internet hit the United States. I mean, we just have not seen the same frenzy on many other issues that the internet has brought to our society as we do usually with sexuality. So sex is a trigger point for all of us.
I'll tell you why I think there's so much fuss about pornography. And that's because there are so many people who have sexually unsatisfying lives. And that wouldn't be such a bad thing if we lived in a country where people said, well, you know, some people have good sex, some people don't. Sometimes we have good sex in the early days of a marriage and then it kind of goes away, and that's kind of the way it is. But, you know, sex is not that important. And, you know, there are 14 other things more important in life than sex. If we lived in a country like that, and I'm not saying we should, but if we lived in a country like that, and a majority of adults were walking around with not terribly satisfying sex lives, you know, nobody'd be making a fuss about pornography. But the fact that we live in a country that simultaneously an awful lot of people walking around sexually unfulfilled, and the whole culture, the whole consumer culture, the whole capitalist system, the whole media industry aimed at people telling them sex is incredibly important. You have to have good sex. If you don't have good sex, there's something wrong. What are you going to do to have better sex? Your neighbors are having better sex than you are. Everybody in the world's having great sex. What's wrong with you? When you're living in that kind of situation, then you have to figure out how to deal with the fact that your sex life is not that satisfying. What are you going to blame? You're going to blame yourself. You're going to blame your partner. You're going to blame God? You know, what are you going to blame for the fact that you simultaneously don't have a terribly satisfying sex life and you're being told every day of your life that sex is incredibly important? I think what a lot of people do is they turn and they look at pornography and they say, aha, that's the reason. That's the reason that my husband doesn't want to have sex with me. That's the reason that I feel unattractive. That's the reason that I can't lose that last 5 pounds. You know, that's the reason. It's the competition that women believe that they're in with pornographic imagery. It's the easiest thing in the world for people to blame because nobody is going to stand up and defend it. The conversation that people are having about, I want to look at porn, well, porn is immoral, you shouldn't do it. I'm not hurting anybody. Yes, you are. It's killing me. That conversation really needs to be about whatever happened to our sex life. And that is a conversation that nobody wants to have. People would rather swim through an ocean of razor blades than have that conversation. Same thing about your kids, you know. What are we going to do about our 12-year-olds who are being exposed to pornography? People would much rather scream about, oh my God, it's the end of the world. My 12-year-old is being exposed to pictures of naked ladies. People would much rather talk about that than how exactly are we going to prepare our young people for sexually satisfying lives? Nobody wants to have that conversation. People want to have the conversation about how are we going to keep our kids away from sex. Okay, that doesn't prepare people for marriage, does it? That doesn't prepare people for adulthood. That doesn't prepare young people for when they're 18 years old and they're drunk. And yes, 18-year-olds sometimes get drunk. That doesn't prepare young people for, I know I'm not supposed to have sex, but Robert just told me that he's in love with me, so I'm supposed to have sex with him now. So there are conversations about sexuality that adults need to be having that they don't want to have. And instead, they're having conversations about pornography that are not helping anybody and not creating more intimacy and not creating young people who are better prepared to deal with adulthood.
Okay, so before we delve into some of those topics, which you just brought up a lot of them, why don't we spend a little bit of time just talking about this sentence that I took out of your book that says pornography is a compendium of fantasy. And you spend quite a bit of time talking about this idea that if we're going to have positive reframes or an ability to have more meaningful conversations, we probably need to start with understanding what pornography is and isn't, and why we're attributing meanings possibly that are not appropriate to our definitions of pornography.
Well, if there's one sentence to select from my book, you picked a good one. There might even be one or two other good ones, but you selected
There
a
might
good
be.
one.
There might be.
I mean, here's the truth. Human beings fantasize. God gave everybody the kind of a mind that encourages imagination. That's the difference between us and polar bears. You know, polar bears can't imagine stuff. We can. Grasshoppers can't imagine stuff. We can. That's why grasshoppers can't build the Golden Gate Bridge. You know, polar bears can't put together a basketball team. But human beings are blessed with this extraordinary capacity that absolutely no other species has. We have the capacity to imagine things that don't exist. And it's so obvious that nobody talks about it. But it's astonishing. It's astonishing. You know, you and I talked a month ago, let's do a podcast, right? That's amazing. That's amazing. Two people who never met each other, they made an agreement, let's do something a month from now, and they talked about what are we going to need in order to accomplish that, and they each did what they needed to do. They showed up at the same time in the same place, and they're doing what they imagined that a month ago that they would do. That's amazing. And that's what makes every human thing possible. People imagine, let's have 3 children, and then we'll have a family, and then we'll do this, and then we'll do that. That's amazing. And people imagine sexual stuff too. People imagine, oh, look at that guy. I wonder what he looks like without his clothes. Oh, look at that woman. I wonder what it's like to be married to her. Oh, look at that woman. I wonder what it's like to kiss her. Look at that woman. I wonder what it's like to smell her. We imagine that stuff. We imagine that stuff. Then human beings take that a step further. They create images over there of what they imagine. They paint something that doesn't exist. They paint a picture. I don't know if you've ever seen the Eiffel Tower. If you've never seen the Eiffel Tower and you knew how to paint, you could actually paint a picture of the Eiffel Tower, you know? If somebody's never been to Salt Lake City, but they have a picture in their mind, there are mountains, and then there's the temple, and there's this, and there's that, you know, the freeway. You could paint a picture of Salt Lake City even if you've never been there. And then you could look at that picture every day. You could look at that picture of Salt Lake City. You could look at that picture of something else. Then you could have somebody get on a stage and they could say, now you've never been to Salt Lake City, but let me tell you what it's like. Or you could have somebody get on a stage and say, I've never been to Salt Lake City, but here's what I imagine it's like. I imagine it's got really wide streets, and I imagine the people are real friendly, and I imagine that, you know, everybody's walking around with a rifle over their shoulder, you know, whatever it is. You could actually have a person standing on stage who's never been to Salt Lake City, and they could say, here's what I imagine Salt Lake City is like. And you might sit there and you might find that an enjoyable thing to spend 5 minutes doing. Listening to somebody who's never been to Salt Lake City, talking about what they imagine it's going to be like. And you might not care if it's an accurate description or not. They might be so funny or they might be so poetic that when they talk about their vision of Salt Lake City, you might not care at all if it's accurate or not. It just might be an entertaining way to spend some time. And you know, when we read Mark Twain, when Mark Twain went west, he wrote about, every day he wrote about what he saw. And some of it is clearly not accurate. Some of it is hilarious. He wrote about frog jumping contests, and he wrote about cowboys, and he wrote about gold miners, and it's hilarious. The true stuff is hilarious, and the stuff he made up is hilarious. Nobody reads Mark Twain because they think it's a documentary. Nobody reads Mark Twain because they want to read about the history of gold mining. But people find it entertaining to read what he imagined it was like. And so some people look at pornography. Pornography is somebody's idea that they made up about what some people might be thinking about sex. There's people in pornography who are having oral sex. Some people find it entertaining to look at that. There's people in pornography who are masturbating. Some people find it entertaining to look at that. There's people who are kissing in pornography. Some people find it entertaining to look at that. And then there's people who don't find any of it entertaining at all. They find it boring or they find it stupid. Those people, I would say, well, don't watch that. If you think Beethoven is boring, don't listen to Beethoven. Personally, I find Beethoven boring, so I don't listen to Beethoven. Nobody says to me, you should. I think if you don't like Beethoven, you shouldn't watch. If you don't like pornography, don't watch. But pornography is a collection of people's sexual imaginations. And if you don't like the fact that that's what people imagine sexually, don't blame the pornography. You know, if I paint a picture of the Eiffel Tower and you think it's ugly, don't blame me, blame the Eiffel Tower, you know? So it turns out that the human imagination, which can imagine sending a rocket to the moon successfully, human imagination that can lay cables under the Pacific Ocean, human imagination that can create a game as crazy as baseball, human imagination that can invent eyeglasses. That human imagination can imagine a lot of stuff when it comes to sex. It can imagine 14 people on a kangaroo. It can imagine people who are mismatched in age or gender. Or it can imagine people having sex in the middle of Times Square. The human imagination can imagine amazing array of sexual things, some of which some people want to do, and they enjoy watching an image of it. Some of it people don't want to do, and they enjoy watching an image of it. Some people like looking at a picture of the Eiffel Tower, and they want to go to France. Other people enjoy looking at a picture of the Eiffel Tower, and they don't want to go to France. They don't like the food. It's a big hassle to get there. It's expensive. But they like looking at a picture or a movie. An American in Paris, you know, Gene Kelly, great movie. So pornography is a big, big basket of human sexual fantasies from every possible direction. Some of them stuff that some people do, some of them stuff nobody does because they defy the laws of gravity. But that's all it is. You know, it's a big basket of human sexual fantasy. And some of that involves people being rough with each other. Some of it involves people being sweet with each other, mostly sweet as it happens.
Well, and I like the fact that you talked about a little bit there at the end about having fantasies or imagination or desires aren't always connected. In other words, when you said the example of us creating this podcast and imagining it, well, we actually did it. And I think this is kind of some of the fears that come out of a partner who's uncomfortable with erotic material that their spouse or partner is looking at is, well, if you're looking at it, if you're fantasizing about it, it must mean you want to do it, or that somehow I'm lacking because I don't offer you that particular outlet that you're interested in. So these are kind of some of the narratives that people start worrying about or have fear-based approaches to.
If you have a couple where they don't talk honestly about sex, she doesn't know how much does he want to do so and such and such. She doesn't know how frustrated he is that she doesn't want to do such and such. She doesn't know exactly how satisfied is he sexually. If you don't talk about sex, you don't know. And if you don't know, some people, when they don't know, they don't worry. Some people, when they don't know, they do worry. But what we do know about human beings in general is that fantasy is not a good predictor of desire. People fantasize about stuff all the time that they don't want to do. People fantasize about quitting their jobs, robbing a bank, and moving to Tahiti. Practically nobody does that, but lots of people imagine that. People
Sure.
imagine killing their boss and getting away with it. Practically nobody does that. People imagine packing up their kids in a FedEx box and sending them to a stranger in Paris, but nobody does that.
Right.
But it's fun to imagine every once in a while.
Yeah.
So there's no reason to think, that sexual fantasy is different from other kinds of fantasy. There's no reason to think that sexual fantasy has a stronger predictive value than other kinds of fantasy. People fantasize about stuff all the time that they don't do, and people fantasize about stuff all the time that they don't want to do. What they want to do is imagine it. That's what they want to do. They don't want to do it, but they want to fantasize about doing it. That's human beings for you.
Sure. It can be a stress relief. It can be a coping mechanism. It can be just fun. It can be relaxing. It can be a lot of different things that have nothing to do with even satisfaction of sexuality. In other words, people can be very satisfied in their sexual lives together and still enjoy erotic image viewing or, like you said, romantic novel reading or whatever it is that brings some stress relief to their life.
So what I see in the office is when a woman says, I think that he's comparing me to porn actresses, or I think he wants me to do what porn actresses do, I say, why don't you ask him? Why don't you just ask him? And so people in the office, if I push them enough, so she will turn to him and she will say, okay, I'm asking you, do you compare me to porn actresses when we have sex? And most of the time the guy says no. And most of the time the woman's not satisfied with that answer. She says, I don't believe you. So I have to ask her, why don't you believe her? I also ask him, why don't you compare your wife to porn actresses? Why don't you? And the answer is almost always, well, because they're actresses and my wife is a real person. That's usually the answer. But a lot of wives, they don't believe that. They say, if you could fantasize about rosy cheeks instead of thinking about me when we have sex, if you could fantasize about rosy cheeks, why wouldn't you do that? Why would you focus on this pathetic bag of bones here? And now we're getting down to something. It's not that I'm not as attractive as the porn actresses. It's I don't feel attractive, period. When you married me, I was a pretty young girl. Now we have 2 kids. I've been working a job. I'm 37 years old, and I don't look like I did when you married me. And I look in the mirror. I have lines on my face. My breasts, which used to be up around here, now they're down around here, I tell middle-aged women, breasts don't sag as you get older. They just relax a little bit. But if a woman isn't feeling attractive, if she doesn't feel good about her body, don't blame porn for that. You can go to the Salt Lake City airport any day of the week. You can go to the supermarket in Salt Lake City any day of the week, and you can see young, attractive women wearing skimpy outfits. Nobody needs pornography to be thinking about young, attractive women. You can just go walk down the street, just go to the supermarket. None of us has a perfect body, and none of us has a perfect face, and none of us at 40 looks the way we did when we were 25, and none of us at 60 looks the way we did when we were 40. So I'm very sympathetic about any woman or man who doesn't like his body or doesn't like their body as much as they used to, or who's afraid that their partner doesn't like their body anymore. I'm extraordinarily sympathetic about that. Let's talk about that. If we wiped out pornography overnight, if there was no more pornography and we didn't change anything else, people would still feel judgmental about their bodies. People would still feel judgmental about the lines in their faces. People would still feel judgmental about my breasts used to be up here and now they're down there. So if that's what people are concerned about, and people have been concerned about that for a very long time also, you can read about that in the Bible. You can read in the Bible adult women being concerned that they're not as attractive as they used to be. Adult women trying to get their husband's attention sexually when it has waned. And that's before broadband internet pornography, right? The Bible. If people are concerned about their bodies and their sexual attractiveness, let's talk about that. And yes, that is painful to talk about. I'm perfectly willing to talk about that with patients. And I'm willing to give people all the tools possible to talk about that instead of having some conversation about pornography over there that's not going to settle anything. People
Well, and
think,
which oftentimes really fall into power struggles. And you talk a bit about that in your book, as far as
right,
these power moves, like, well, I don't want this, I do. And then the conversation kind of gets stuck in those particular superficial narratives instead of
right.
like you're mentioning now, digging deeper as to what are we really afraid of? What are we really feeling? What are we suffering about? And how does the overall culture, I mean, women are given a pretty constant message that if you don't look a certain way, then you're not really allowed to feel sexual, and so it takes some kind of self-differentiating skills to be able to combat, these messages. Men are given lots of messages too. We're all given messages, in general about how we're not good enough, we're not sexy enough, we're not this enough. And those things I think really play out in these relationships that you're talking about.
Right. And conflict about pornography is just empty calories. Conflict about pornography doesn't get at anything substantial. Because I've been a marriage counselor for 37 years. I've been a marriage counselor since before the internet was invented, if you can wrap your brain around that. I've been a marriage counselor since before the invention of cell phones and smartphones. I was a marriage counselor before anybody had a computer, except at NASA,
Mm-hmm.
I see the exact same level of marital frustration and discord today that I did 35 years ago.
Right.
People forget, there was a lot of divorce before broadband internet pornography,
Mm-hmm.
There was a lot of marital discord before pornography was in everybody's home. There was a lot of sexual frustration. There were a lot of women feeling terrible about their bodies before 24/7 porn. So getting rid of 24/7 porn forever won't even make a dent in how people feel about themselves or each other. And that doesn't make a person pro-porn to say that. That just makes a person thoughtful about the nature of relationships in modern America. There's an awful lot of pressure on people sexually and relationally, and that pressure isn't going to change just because you get rid of pornography.
Yeah, I completely agree. And there's a bit of a double standard too. In other words, I think it's, for some reason, it's okay for women to look at a romantic movie and look at her partner, and say, geez, why can't you be more romantic and loving and give me a candlelight dinner? And, whereas if the man looks over at his wife and says, geez, why can't you, look at me the way she's looking at him when she's having sex with him, or, saying these things like fuck me please or something, right? Like that's not going to go over as well, I think, in our culture.
Right.
So there's an interesting, I think, double standard again around sexuality, which I do think is morally informed or religiously informed, as far as our culture, that certain things are okay one way versus the other.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I'm going to let you have the last word on that, Natasha. It's been a really great hour to talk with you about this, and the people in Utah are pretty lucky to have you as a resource, I think.
Well, thank you. And I want to throw out that you're going to be in Utah this coming in a few weeks at the Rocky Mountain Sex Summit. So, and I'll be there, so it'll be exciting to meet you in person. And just to give a shout out to that entity that I think is going to be really fabulous. I hope a lot of people choose to attend that. So it's going to be
Friday, September 22.
Yes, and the 23rd. So Saturday as well. Thank you again so much for your time, for a really, I think, valuable conversation. And I hope that this at least helps people start being curious about this ability to be more open about these issues that are probably really painful in a lot of relationships.
Thank you. And thank you for mentioning my current book, His Porn, Her Pain, Confronting America's Porn Panic with Honest Talk About Sex. Thank you for quoting from it. Absolutely. And there's great material in there, great facts that we didn't get to, and also a great literacy porn checklist, which I really recommend, especially when talking to kids. And I've recommended it often. So thank you for your work. Thank you, Natasha.
We took the long road home, turned minutes into miles. And as the evening traveled on, the sunset bathed your smile. We stopped beneath the desert stars, wrapped in each other's arms. Was as simple as I love you, an ordinary, extraordinary truth.
It's been a long road here, a trail with tears, pain and sorrow too.
But through every storm we traveled on, like lovers do. And if sometimes we fell apart, we always came back home. Was as simple as I love you, an ordinary, extraordinary truth. Some people say love is blind and forever is too long. But I see your eyes in every sunrise. Can't imagine life alone. Let's take the long road on together until we're gone. Want you by my side till the day I die and into the beyond. It's as simple as our love is. That's how I wanna go, all wrapped up in the arms of our extraordinary, it's nothing ordinary love. Ordinary. No, it's extraordinary.